This is LRBT3, Flaw question number 23. And then we have a social critic who argues that this idea of making children feel shame is one of the ways that we socialize children in this society, or one of the most important ways. Um, and even though this is important, they also say like this results in deep feelings of guilt and self-loathing that can be a severe hardship. So we're like, okay, so there's deep feelings, those are difficult. Doesn't sound too out of what we would expect. And then the conclusion is moral socialization has had a net effect of increasing the total amount of suffering. So we know that this is a vulnerable, well, the argument is vulnerable to criticism. So we're looking for something that, the social critic actually does in this reasoning that would make it actually a very poor argument, or that's just vulnerable. There's flaws that we can exploit. Um, so the social critic himself, what he's doing, or he or she is doing, is they're saying, this is one way that we do socialize children, and so moral socialization net increases the total amount of suffering because it results in certain feelings of guilt and self-loathing. However, we don't know if that is like an absolute given that this always happens. It's one of the most important ways, but there are also other ways that we socialize children too. Um, so let's look. So A overlooks the possibility that the purported source of a problem could be modified to avoid that problem without being eliminated altogether. So I mean, this is something I guess he does overlook it, but that's not really what we're trying to get at. We're not trying to avoid it being and not eliminate it. We're trying to get to this idea of moral socialization has had a net increase of total suffering. So this is like an interesting, idea, but it's not going to harm our argument. It doesn't have anything to do with it. B fails to address adequately the possibility that one phenomenon may causally contribute to the occurrence of another, even though the phenomena do not always occur together. So, I mean, maybe this is what the social critic is doing, but we're saying moral socialization has had a net effect of increasing the total amount of suffering. We don't really need to make a causal argument here. And even if there was a causal argument, it's true that these don't always occur together, sure, but what does causal have to do with anything? We're just saying that this has contributed to a net effect of increasing suffering. C presumes without providing justification that a phenomenon that supposedly increases the total amount of suffering in a society should therefore be changed or eliminated, regardless of its beneficial consequences. We're actually not presuming that there should be a change. The conclusion is that there's a net effect of increasing total suffering. C is tricky because, our natural inclination would be, okay, well, if there's total suffering going on or a total increase in the suffering, we should eliminate it. We don't like suffering. But that's something that we supplied, not the social critic. D takes for granted the behavior that sometimes leads to a certain phenomenon cannot also reduce the overall occurrence of that phenomenon. So, so what does that mean? So, if we take that for granted that the behavior, so the socializing them, sometimes leads to a certain phenomenon, so, creates the shame, feelings of guilt and self-loathing and severe hardship, cannot also significantly reduce the overall occurrence of that phenomenon. So, the more that you socialize children, it can result in deep feelings of guilt and hardship, but it also could eliminate those feelings of guilt and hardship. And, the more we socialize them and make them ashamed of immoral behavior, um, it eliminates the overall occurrence of that immoral behavior and thus the overall occurrence of the feelings of self-loathing and guilt and all the good things. So I guess that does happen in our passage. And now we're asking ourselves, like, does that call the conclusion into question? Does that hurt the argument? And that actually would. Let's say if this did, if we did, lessen the immoral behavior and therefore lessen the shame, then moral socialization would actually be reducing some suffering there, or it would have a net zero effect. We're just trying to think, is there any possible way that it could have, that it would not have a net effect of increasing, meaning that it either goes down or it stays the same. So D seems like it does the trick, but let's check out E. So E presumes, without providing justification, that if many people have a negative psychological reaction to a phenomenon, so in this case, that would be the immoral behavior, no one can have a positive reaction to that phenomenon. So I think this is something that, it does, like we do take it for granted, but it's not presuming it. And, they're not saying no one can have a positive reaction because no one, that gets to the individual level, but we're talking about net effect. So maybe like 5 people have a positive reaction under the social critics framework, but then like 20 people have a net negative, like a negative, meaning that like they're suffering. So if 20 people are suffering and 5 people are like, not suffering, or they're like, actually thriving with this like self-loathing or something like that, or immoral behavior, um, that's actually still a net increase. So the keyword would be net there. So we would pick D as our best answer.